Sejam bem-vindos a mais um IBGC Conecta, onde discutimos tendências de mercado e seus impactos sobre a governança corporativa. Eu sou o Aron Zylberman e irei moderar o Conecta de hoje, onde falaremos sobre mudança climática na era pós-covid. Nós teremos um time muito forte aqui com a gente, um Dream Team aqui para falar do assunto. A Karina Litvak, que é conselheira e diretora executiva do Chapter Zero, ela vai explicar para a gente o que é isso. O Mauro Cunha, nosso presidente, foi nosso presidente aqui no IBGC, foi presidente da MEC, é conselheiro independente de empresas. E a Denise Pauli, que é vice-presidente da Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure e consultora associada da Aggrego Consultores, e tem uma carreira brilhante no setor financeiro brasileiro. Participe da discussão enviando suas perguntas pelo chat e não deixe de preencher a pesquisa de satisfação disponível no descritivo do evento. Aproveite também para se inscrever no nosso canal e assim você será notificado das próximas transmissões. O Conecta vai ao ar semanalmente. Então, a partir de agora, nós vamos fazer a nosso webinar em inglês, ok? E vamos começar agora. Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you today and starting our conversation. I'm going to ask each of you to make your initial statements. So let's start with Karina. Karina, please.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you also for all of you making the effort to speak and listen, speak in and listen to English, which I am very grateful that it's only for me, so I'm feeling quite guilty. So my name is Karina Litvak. As Aron just said, I serve on a number of boards, in particular, the board of the Italian oil and gas major ENI. And that is what brought me to working on this topic of corporate governance in relation to climate change or climate governance, because joining that board, I realized just how immensely challenging it is for directors to play a genuinely constructive part in driving a climate transition strategy from within the boardroom. So together with the World Economic Forum and other colleagues, I created something called the Climate Governance Initiative, which is now something that we're working with IBGC to bring to Brazil. So I'm really delighted to be here today with all of you to speak about the role of climate change in the boardroom, or the role of directors in driving an effective climate transition strategy.
Thank you. Denise, your time.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event. For many times, I really wanted to be here, and so that's the time. Just a minute about my career. I've been with the financial system for the last more than 30 years, investment banking, asset management, and because of this asset management role, I was invited to be part of the task force on climate financial disclosure to represent the asset managers. This task force intends to release some information that should be disclosed by companies, banks, insurance groups, as well as asset managers and asset owners. It's focused on climate change, the transition to an economy with lower emission of gas, and to help companies to be resilient through this transition. I think this is the major goal of the task force. We have been releasing yearly reports, status reports. We had one in 2017, and then we have had several reports. In September, we released another one, a stats report, and also some papers on how to introduce scenario analysis and what to use to measure the risks, and a very special chapter on risk management, because that's the key issue for being able to go through this whole process.
Okay, thank you. Mauro, your turn.
Hello, Ron. Good morning, everybody. I'm probably the stranger in the nest here, if you can use this expression, the more recent convert to the issue of climate change and ENS. I've been mostly a G person all my life. I was an equity analyst and an investor. I started getting involved in the governance of listed companies in Brazil. I've been joining boards since 1999, and usually with a very heavy focus on making governance work. More recently, today I sit on the board of several organizations, including 2 state-owned companies. And I've noticed that we have some very big challenges in board processes in Brazilian companies, in which some boards work too much, some boards work too little, and in the end of the day, both groups tend to think very little about risk management. And I think it's very fortunate that the IBGC is now bringing us to discuss an issue like climate change, because I think it runs into the essence of risk management and its importance for the sustainability of the corporation as a whole. It requires a strategic thinking and a long-term thinking that I think are still lagging in most boards. And by thinking about the issues that Karina and Denise will bring to us, I think we can improve the whole process around boards in Brazil.
Okay, look, before I start making questions to you guys, and I hope to receive a lot of questions from our audience, I was making a research here about how this ESG agenda started. And the story of ESG investment began in January 2004 with an initiative of former Secretary General Kofi Annan from the United Nations. So Global Compact and around 50 plus CEOs, they produced a report called Who Cares Wins. This was published in 2005, okay? Among the many ESG factors that are viewed as having financial relevance, climate change has a very important place. So my question is, at your point of view, this is for real. So this is really something that boards are discussing hardly today everywhere. And I'm not talking only about Northern Europe or Northern America. I'm talking about the world in general. I would like to have your opinion on that, starting with Karina. Your sound, your mic is off. Okay.
Thank you. The answer to your question is no. Most boards are not, a few, but most boards are not focusing on climate change, certainly not as an issue that belongs in the strategic decision-making. To the extent that most boards look at these questions, they tend to focus on the more operational types of sustainability issues that I would call good housekeeping, good health and safety, good product safety, good employee relations, good environmental management, by which I mean don't pollute the water, don't pollute the river where your factory is, don't pollute the air, because if you do, you'll get fines. But climate change is so much more complex because it is systemic. And what one company does is not going to solve the problem. And so typically, many companies think, well, look, regulation, government needs to pass a law, we will comply. But it's not for us to solve a massive global problem, even though we all accept now, or most of us, that what the science tells us, that if we fail to act, the planet will fail to serve as a viable home for the human race and for businesses to continue to operate profitably. But most businesses see this as beyond their ability to actually manage it. So they tend to focus on what is within their perimeter, within their area of control. It's fairly recent that boards, investors are way ahead of us, by the way, but, and I used to be an investor like all of you. So it's fairly recent that the issue of climate change has come inside the boardroom, where companies are being more or less forced to figure out what their role is in contributing to the solution. So the most visible change was last January when Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, announced that, you know, BlackRock was going to pay attention to this issue, and where BlackRock goes, you know, everybody goes, because, you know, they own typically 2 or 3% of all of us, so we have to listen to them. And, you know, plenty of investors have been saying this for 20 or 25 years, but BlackRock said it in January, and suddenly it became extremely important. And it's a challenge, precisely because of what I said before. It is systemic in nature, and all of us need to do something in order for there to be a viable result.
Okay, Denise, please jump in.
I agree with Karina. It's true. It's just a part of boards that is really inserting this discussion into the board strategic issues. And we see this more often, of course, in Europe and Asia, Australia, and less in other countries. But also we see more in companies that depend on water, companies that are subject to stress, hydric stress. So in this sense, it's easier for them to understand what does it mean, rather than someone that's not directly, you know, impacted by the hydric stress. So I think this is what about we are doing here to raise awareness of how important is to discuss those risks, because or we either are suffering the risk directly as a company, or we are impacting other segments that will get back to the company itself. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to think not as only, and this is not to reduce the importance, but not a separated sustainability issue. This is peer risk management. And I think that's a transition that we have to go through.
I wanted to add a little spice here by disagreeing partly with my friend Karina here. I'm not sure investors are that much advanced than companies or banks in relation to climate change. That may be true in Europe, especially for some more responsible investors. But when I think globally, even US, I take it with a grain of salt, and certainly in Brazil, we see some investors talking about ESG, but without doing their homework. And quite honestly, I don't see how investors could talk seriously to companies about ESG if they don't understand their own fiduciary duties in relation to these concepts. And that translates into the concept of stewardship. I'm not going to get too much into that because, you know, I like that topic a lot, and that would be a totally different conversation. But I think that here in Brazil, especially given the efforts of the central bank, banks may even be more of a force to make companies think about it than institutional investors today, despite all of the talk.
I think that's a fair criticism, if I can just, I think that's an entirely fair criticism. Having been myself in the investor community for 20 years, it always was very fragmented, and you had a range of different views, including the very largest funds, the very largest asset managers, who were actually obstructing progress on this area. But I do think that even those words, that letter that BlackRock put out, okay, a lot of people will call into question how genuine it is and how much action there will be behind the words of the letter and so forth. But, you know, it is a step forward. And I can and here's the difference. In my boardroom, for the longest time, the perception was this is a fringe issue. It is only a minority of investors that are raising this issue. The mainstream of the investor community is ignoring it. And that changed. That changed. The BlackRock letter was definitely an indicator of that change. But what my CEO then told us is that in his roadshow that he made in January after this Davos announcement, every major investor asked about this. Now, I think you're right, Mauro. They're not necessarily all that clued up on it. They don't necessarily do their homework, and they don't necessarily have talent inside the firm, but they're also busy stealing good people from the smaller pioneering asset managers. So I do think it behooves us all as board directors to watch which investment houses are, how they're moving and how they're taking people from smaller firms, because that's indicative of where they're going to go with this issue.
Good point.
Denise, let me ask you something about this conversation. We talked about greenwashing. Now we are talking about purpose washing. And are we really walking the talk, or do you think there's a lot of talking and not enough walking in this field?
I think it's we as task force, we see this, to be very honest, as a process of transition. We have reached a number of 1,200 companies around the world that are reporting in different levels. They are in true reporting, but at different levels. The ones that are able to report the full disclosure indication, just a few, 10%, I would say, but many of them are really trying. And I think many initiatives in countries that we are mapping are doing a lot of good for this initiative. And the most important, and maybe is where we are trying to focus our attention now, is how to transform all of this in value, how we monetize this. Because as we know, people are trying to make profits, to grow, to tap the market, to beat the market. So it's not easy for someone that's, taking care of the company to do all and still be totally focused on ESG and especially climate change. But what our intention is to have more and more people engaged. As Mauro mentioned, I think that's very important. There are two initiatives. Actually, the task force is an initiative of the Financial Stability Board, because the Financial Stability Board, when we had the agreement, the Paris Agreement, said, well, let's see if this risk is a real one, and everybody knows that's a top risk when you talk about the trends, risk trends in the world, how the banks are treating it. Banks will be resilient, the financial system will be resilient. So I think this type of movement helps a lot. And also there is the United Nations has a movement with asset managers that are saying that they are going to net zero by 2050 their portfolio. So I think we don't have the perfect world. We are far from the perfect world, but the importance is this is real. This is already in place. This is not something that we are going to see in the future. And if people don't understand that is a risk, then we have a problem.
Let me talk a little bit.
Go ahead, Mauro, please.
Denise mentioned disclosure, and both the task force and Chapter 0 speak a lot about disclosure. But disclosure can be actually something negative in a way if it doesn't reflect reality. And I don't think it does. I don't really think it does. And it doesn't for a few reasons. First, and again, I'm talking about risk management in general. Every board that I joined took me a lot of effort to reconcile the risk management disclosures with the actual risk map that the company uses. The risk management disclosure is provided by lawyers, and it doesn't reflect how companies work. Of course, you need to listen to the lawyers. You don't want to get sued, but essentially, you need to tell how risk management works. And as long as this is the type of disclosure we have, all the effort into creating the framework to disclose about climate risk will actually be counterproductive. So companies and non-executive directors in particular need to pay a lot of attention to what is being said about the processes of risk management. And we need to ensure that we have the adequate governance, that these disclosures are actually read and understood and criticized by responsible investors who actually know what we're talking about. most investors that have engaged with my companies have not even read the disclosures. And I mean, even worse to say, how many have criticized the disclosure and actually tried to assess to which extent it reflected reality. So it's a big problem right in the root of things that need to be addressed if we actually want things to move forward.
Okay, I have a question for you three, and then I will jump to the questions of our audience. They are popping up here, a lot of very good questions. My question is about timing. The time is ticking all the time. Do we have time to avoid a major catastrophe in the world? You see, we are talking about the pandemic. So the pandemic is going away. I don't know how many months more, but it's going away in a certain point. But climate change is not like the pandemic, okay? It's coming to stay. And as the time is ticking, are we doing what we do have to do, what we really have to do to avoid a terrible scenario?
All right, I'm going to take this one and answer it one of two ways. One is, the answer is, the time to act was 20 or 30 years ago when we already had the evidence, and we have let precious time be wasted, and we are not going to be successful in doing everything that is necessary because we have started so late. However, I have a new baby granddaughter who was born 3 weeks ago, and my personal attitude is, that's just too bad, we have to get on with it, because we are responsible for this generation. And so I feel on a very personal level that we just have to do what it takes. And human ingenuity is actually quite impressive when we put our mind to it. So we have been appallingly irresponsible, criminally irresponsible in the last 30 years in how we have behaved as a species and how our generation has behaved vis-a-vis future generations. But we haven't got time to worry about whether it's possible to fix it. We just have to get on with fixing it. And there are so many ways in which we can act. Each and every person has the opportunity to contribute. And certainly we in the boardroom, we have the power, and immense power, to influence corporate behavior, but we often lack the knowledge that is necessary to use our power to full effect. And so efforts like this one, what IBGC is supporting today, is about matching that power that we as board directors have with the available information to actually make a difference. I mean, I can see this from my own experience. I joined an oil and gas board 6 years ago, where quite frankly, we were not doing very much on the climate transition. We were doing lots of great things on, minimizing pollution and, cutting flaring and, reducing emissions and things like that. But we were not transforming the strategy of the company. I mean, let's face it, oil and gas is an industry that is going to face enormous disruption. We have to acknowledge that fact, and we have to reinvent who we are. It took us 6 years to get to the point where we were able to announce that we will reinvent who we are in a really radical way. And that comes from a CEO who was visionary, and quite frankly, people like myself on the board who pushed and pushed and pushed for us not just to follow, but to lead. And leading is risky. Leading is risky because you risk being actually criticized by your investors, which we sometimes were. You risk being criticized and ostracized by your peers with whom we formed joint ventures, who really, called into question what we were doing and saying. And most of all, you risk being ahead of legislation in a way that puts you at a commercial disadvantage. So these are all things you have to break the mold in order to make a difference. And you have to have the courage to do things that are outside the norm of what a normal chief executive or a normal board might have done in the old days, because the old ways are not good enough. So we have to invent new ways of doing business.
Aron, allow me to split your question in two, and I'm not going to get into the "is it too late" thing because Karina answered it brilliantly. But you also touched on how this is changing with the perspective of COVID-19. And I think COVID-19, we have the risk of having the wrong reaction here. So everybody now looking to add the pandemic to the risk map and to buy insurance against that, which will be quite expensive now. That's the wrong consequence. But I think the good consequence is that it will force boards to pay more attention to risk management. Risk management needs to get more airtime because it doesn't get it. Today, when risk management works, it doesn't get attention because there's no problem. And when there is a problem, it's already too late. I think that discussing risk at the board, and I know some companies who actually do very good risk management, but the board doesn't know about it. It doesn't own the process. So this system, the oversight, will actually come to the board now. And the other thing is that this situation has also brought Brazil into the reality of low interest rates. Low interest rates are essential to allow us to think really long term. We can now realistically talk about a 30, 40-year horizon. And when you do that, climate change starts to be quite relevant. You have the excuse of not being able to think about it if you have double-digit interest rates or cost of capital. Now that's no longer true. So we have the conditions in place to have proper attention to risk management on the board and to actually focus on the long-term issues that will affect the sustainability of the company.
Denise, any comments?
Yeah, I think that's aside of what they really pointed out in a very good way. I think this is a matter not only of risk, but also opportunities. And when we talk about opportunities, we are talking about opportunities of new products, new way of doing things, more efficient, reducing the usage of energy, not only because it's nice and correct to reduce the usage of fossil fuel energy, but also because it really impacts the cost. Also, because creates a relationship with the consumers that shows how much you are engaged with this question. So that's why I said in the beginning, our main challenge is to transform as executives, as board members, and as society, is to translate this into a more practical way of looking at, and then we can follow. Because while it's too high in concepts, I think people feel a lot of difficulty of bringing it down. So our objective now is to translate into KPIs that will be that companies and boards will be able to follow and really supervise in order to achieve new ways of reaching this transition path. I don't think we did all we needed, but we have to start right now. I have no doubt.
Denise, your speech makes me think about something that money talks and talks very, very loud. So let's talk about compensation. So how can we arrange compensation systems that make board members and C-level executives really think about climate change seriously?
Okay, I'll take this one. When I first joined my board in 2014, my oil board, I was a member of the compensation committee and I served on it for 3 years. I then was taken off and then I was just put back on 3 years later. At the time, in 2014, we thought that we were extremely bold and innovative and pioneering because we introduced a 25% part of the annual bonus that was tied to 50-50, so 12.5% twice for health and safety targets and reducing greenhouse gas emissions on a year-to-year basis. We thought we were great. And, you know, if you look at what's going on in the oil and gas and mining sectors, that was kind of the state of the art. except that I came from the investor world where I was saying to them, guys, this is like running the business with your eyes firmly fixed on the rear view mirror, retrovisor or something like that, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, because what we emit year on year tells us nothing about the product that we make. And it is the product that's the problem. So we need to think about remuneration structures and policies that are going to reward our leaders for transforming the business. So let's talk about that. And the answer I got back from management and from the then chair of the competition committee was, we can't do that because we don't have a transformation strategy. So first we have to transform the strategy, have a strategy to transform the business. And then we can think about identifying key performance indicators that will link pay to those steps along the way to get us to 2030, 2040, 2050. So it's taken us 6 years to get there, 6 years. Last May, we put out to shareholders a proposal that put 40% of the long-term reward tied to industrial targets that are about transforming our petroleum refineries into biorefineries, our petrochemical business into biochemicals, just a variety of different indicators that are specifically related to taking the business from how it is today to how it will be ultimately in 2050, but working out where we'll be in 2023, because every year we're moving steadily towards that long-term goal. But that, yeah.
How long is long-term in your compensation system?
Well, this is the problem. Okay, so it's we have the LTIP, the long-term incentive plan, is has got a 3-year maturation, plus there's another, I think, 2 years where the award is withheld and then multiplied, there's a multiplier applied if certain targets are achieved. So maximum 5 years, which means that by definition, you're not getting to 2030, let alone 2050. So that is why the challenge for the board is in working out where we're going to be long-term, and then what are those interim points on the journey that we can identify as getting us to where we need to be. Because if we invest, from having been in Petrobras, we in the board are asked to approve every month proposals that are in the billions of dollars that have a 40-year life on them, give or take, 30 to 50, long lives. If we approve those things now, we need to have a pretty clear view of what our production profile will be in the longer term, so that we're not investing billions today that are going to be basically the subject of massive write-downs, as has been happening, as you know, in the oil and gas industry. So it really forces us to think long-term. And so to your question, Mauro, we need to translate those long-term goals into medium-term kind of artificial goals. And what it's done, here's the thing, this is what's so interesting. Until a few months ago, we were getting every month proposals for brand new greenfield projects that had 30, 40-year lives on them. Now, the only projects we get are extensions, which are basically taking an existing field and drilling right next door where all the infrastructure is already in place. The payback is very, very rapid. The ramp up is going to be in the next 2 or 3 years, and the whole thing will be done in 7 years. And the idea here is that we have already shifted our thinking to a view where we don't have long to go in the old business, and we just need to manage it as profitably as possible, generate as much cash as possible. Do not manage it for the long term of oil and secondarily gas, but manage it for the short term to generate maximum cash so that you can plow that into the clean technologies that really are the future of the business. That is a complete shift in thinking, and that is reflected in the pay structure.
Any comment, Mauro?
Well, it was a trick question because Aron came up with this half an hour ago, so I have to think about it. Hopefully, Karina gave some very good insights that I hope stay recorded and people watch over and over again. because these reflections need to take place. When we think about the Brazilian reality, I think there's an initial step we need to think of, which is we need to get out of the prejudiced view that non-executive directors are not to get any equity compensation. So if these people are responsible for the long-term strategy and sustainability of the company, they need to get equity with very long vesting. And I'm not talking about stock options. I'm talking about the profile of compensation, not the level. So that is one first step that we need to address. Second, and that's the reason for my question, I think we need to think about longer vesting periods. We're not going to get to 2030 or 50, but I think the Brazilian frame of mind is stuck in the 3-year duration, which I think is very short, even to consider these interim targets that we can think of. And finally, what I think could be quite useful to focus the minds of executives is the idea of malus. I mean, the negative impact on even short-term compensations of serious deviations from sustainability targets, including climate change. So if that may be more effective, because the whole idea of setting the interim targets is subject to uncertainty. But if you get executives to avoid certain results, their actions will probably be focused where we want them to be focused.
Denise, there's a disease in our system, short-termism. And I think this is really tricky. Any comments on that? Do you see any way out of this problem?
I think if I may say, the secret is in the board. The secret is in the board, because as long as the board really asks for long-term planning, even if you can make adjustments that are really needed to reach market objectives, because market is really short-termist, you can improve that. I think the secret is in the board. Board is the first one, the first organism that could include longer-term, define longer-term objectives. It's like, the politicians here that have a term, and the next one thinks, well, this is not exactly what I want to do. But if this is something that belongs to the company, then your chance of getting through in a longer term is higher. And I'm not guaranteeing that's the only one, but I think the secret is in the board. I don't see other ways. And of course, you can call regulation. You can call regulation. What we see abroad, it's a series of regulators jumping in to set some goals. Just an example, in Canada, the president said, if you want to have the line of help for financing activities during the COVID, you gotta disclose under TCFD recommendations. If you don't get it. So, this is the highest level of commitment that you can have from a country. And you also have the regulators that can help. I think what we are trying to do now, since it's new and has a lot of things that we don't understand yet, is to have a voluntary movement. And that's what the task force is doing. And if the board members understand that and introduce these concepts that has everything to do, I agree totally with Mauro, has totally to do with risk management. This is not a subject that just came out of the blue to come into our lives. This is reality. As you have financial risk, market risk, credit risk, you have this risk, because Karina mentioned about the emissions emission itself, but also you have the usage of clean water, the reusage of water. So there are many other subjects that are needed to be, treated. So I think a board has a major role.
I'd like to offer a comment, if I may, on risk and on Mauro's, well, both of you have emphasized the need to focus on this. So, in an industry that has a very long legacy of operating in a certain way and assets that still have decades to go, the barriers to transformation are very powerful, including right up here in people's heads. When we announced at the end of February our transition strategy to 2050, the very first question from the room, from a sell-side analyst, was, well, it was really obnoxious. It was, looks like you're really going to satisfy the ESG crowd, but what about the execution risk? Have you weighed what that's going to mean? What if you get this wrong? And where he was going with this question is, there's a large camp of investors out there whose attitude is, I didn't buy you to reinvent who you are. If I don't like what you're doing, I'll pull my money out and I will invest it in Tesla or, some young, innovative, agile company. I don't want to put my money in an oil company so that it can experiment with new strategies, new technologies, and maybe fail. I just want you to do what you know how to do. I want you to pay me dividends. And when I decide that I don't want to have exposure to your industry, I will pull my money out. Well, that's the kiss of death for an industry that needs to transform, because it's a message that says, just stay who you are and become obsolete. And the answer that my CEO gave was, the execution risk of business as usual is far greater than what we've just laid out to you, because the high returns that we have seen in our industry are not going to be sustained, and they are going to be subject to immense volatility. So those returns on a risk-adjusted basis are no longer going to be attractive. What is much more attractive is us shifting into these new technologies that may, in some cases, have a lower nominal IRR, but the risk associated with it is so much lower. And we, of course, are bringing with it, our expertise, our relation, all the stuff that make us, better than everybody else. So you should put your money with us. But the point he was making was, your perception of the risk profile of our company is mistaken. We have understood that the risk we face is greater than it used to be. And so we are reshaping our business to adapt to that. So I think, Mauro and Denise, you're absolutely right. There has been a misunderstanding of the implications of risk. The risk frameworks that we had, I served on the risk committee, and I used to be really frustrated with the fact that, every quarter we would get an update, and every quarter it would say that our climate risk was low. And I kept thinking, how can you say that? How can you say that climate risk is low in the oil and gas sector? It's high, even though we're doing all these things to mitigate by reducing flaring or reducing, whatever it is we're doing. That's not actually shifting the business. Suddenly a light bulb went off somewhere, because I didn't see it, because as Mauro says, the board doesn't see the detail. Management is doing the risk management and bringing you the teeny, teeny tip of the iceberg. But then when they had that light bulb moment, they shifted completely, and suddenly business as usual was no longer acceptable.
And I think the consequence of what we're talking here, we're discussing a lot about risk, and Denise mentioned opportunity, is something that Karina touched, but I think we should focus more, which is strategy. Once you understand that it is not a low risk and that it is an opportunity, climate change needs to be plugged into strategy. And I've seen companies where sustainability answers to human resources. I've seen companies where sustainability answers to marketing. And you can look at all the legalese, and they are talking about ESG. Some are even adherent to the UN Pact or to PRI, whatever. But in practice, it is not central to what companies are doing. Now, I also agree with Denise when she said that the boardroom is where change needs to happen. I would only add that it's not going to happen as a monolith. It will happen board member by board member. And I think it is easier to change the individual board members than to change the companies. But one is a prerequisite to the other. We need to have individuals who are driving change so that the board becomes a force of change. And then we get to change the processes of the company. Because as Karina described, there's going to be a lot of obstacles within companies and within stakeholders that actually don't even think that this is our job to do it. So I think that a dialogue like this and initiatives such as Karina's and Denise and now the IBGC are key to bring that change into the boardroom.
Guys, I'm going to bring some questions from our audience now, okay? So first, Daniela Manoli, she has a question to Karina, okay? How does the financial market access what the companies are really doing in ESG, despite the efforts in reporting like the ones Denise were pointing out, okay?
Yeah, excellent question. So there's been a huge ramp up in effort to improve the quality of disclosure, and the TCFD is probably the best example of that. But going back to what Mauro said, disclosure can often be a way of obfuscating what is really happening. And I've seen this, you know, if you're smart, you get yourself a disclosure framework, you study it, you deconstruct it, and then you figure out how to tick every box and score, you know, A+. And it doesn't mean that you have actually transformed the business. It just means that you have made the necessary changes to please the disclosure framework, right? And you have to, as the consumer of this information, you have to be pretty clever to see past that, to look at what has really changed. The great thing about the TCFD, I mean, there are flaws and there are advantages. So the flaws in the TCFD, which I think are to some degree inevitable, is that they focus on the how, right? They focus on the process. You know, does the board do this? Do you have metrics? Do you have, you know, do you have systems to do X, Y, and Z? When the first batch of TCFD reports came out 2 years ago, Mark Carney spoke at an event where he said, this first crop of reports is very informative, because what it shows us is that the best companies are very good on process. You know, they're very transparent on process. They're very good at telling us whether somebody on the board understands climate change, whether there's a committee, how often the committee met, how many hours those meetings lasted, right? What nobody has told us. And he says, and I'm sure they will, but they haven't yet told us how the business is going to be made more resilient to cope with a net zero world. Now, of course, the answer was because nobody had done it, so there was nothing to report. What the reporting framework had done was push people to put the tools in place, but the actual actions that were necessary to be able to move the machine in a different direction, that had not yet happened. It's starting to happen. And by the way, the title of this seminar is Climate Change or Climate Governance in the Age of COVID. The COVID crisis is like a shock treatment to do this, because you mentioned, Denise, you mentioned Canada. I'm Canadian, so I'm very proud that you know, Prime Minister Trudeau made this announcement that you only get your federal funding if you comply with the TCFD disclosure framework. He would never have been able to do this in a pre-COVID world, because Canada has its own Texas, which is Alberta, which is you know, dependent on oil. Canada is essentially a country whose wealth has been built on oil and mining and agriculture. So this is an extremely difficult topic in Canada. It is a topic that divides people according to where they live, what sector they operate in, and therefore what politics they have. It's like the United States. But because of what happened with the COVID crisis, Trudeau was able to say, all right, that's it. We're spending tens of billions, hundreds of billions to save the economy. We're going to save it this way, and you can't stop me. And this is an opportunity for the world, not just Canada, right? And there's a lot of talk about green rebuilding, build back better, the EU Green Deal. Certainly 25% of the EU recovery plan is going to be dedicated to green and climate friendly investment. And, you know, we are going into massive debt to save the economy. We're going to put it to good use.
Just add something. I think it's perfect what Karina said. Just to add, one thing that we are doing at Task Force is using AI, to see what companies are really disclosing. We are not entering the quality yet, but we are, you know, with this process, we are trying to see who is disclosing. And the other thing that the Task Force is doing now, one of the steps that we are moving forward is a description of the resilience of the company in a scenario of a reduction of emission, and if not, how they are going to deal with. So I think the resilience is a way of answering, and we don't have, as I said, the qualities is still being built, but we do have a lot of companies that are already disclosing.
I have a question here from our friend Charles Putz, talking about benchmarking. And the question is, what about the companies, which are the companies that are really doing something about climate change? So I would like that each of you could give us a very good example of outstanding companies in the field of facing this risk of climate change, if you have any. Your silence is embarrassing.
No. We agreed we wouldn't talk about existing commitments. There are companies doing excellent work. And as I mentioned, interestingly, some of the best work I've seen are not even reaching the board. So there's a disconnect there. And on the other hand, we have the risk that some of the awareness about sustainability in general could actually be counterproductive. We've had the example of the Norwegian pension fund, for example, blacklisting Electrobras, which is perhaps one of the largest clean energy companies in the world. So I think companies need to make an effort to disclose what they're doing, but most companies still have a lot of homework to do. The outstanding examples, at least in Brazil, are the exception to the rule. And I want to add one example, so it's not a current commitment. When I joined Petrobras in 2013, the company didn't have a chief risk officer. The company didn't have a risk dashboard, an integrated one. It had different areas. And when I left it in 2015, 5 years ago, it still didn't have it. It was starting to implement it. So this is how young we are to really discussing the sustainability of companies. So even companies that think they're doing a good job, they should keep working on it, because we have a lot of ground to cover before we reach best class. And we have best class companies in Brazil, lots of them. But in this aspect, risk management and climate change, we should really look to Europe for the best examples.
I'm going to jump in with a couple of examples. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
No, okay. No, I would just say that in our status report of the task force that we released in September, there will be some examples of companies that are doing it. Okay, that's interesting to check. We know some in Brazil. They're doing a very good job, and I would say more in a forest segment, but abroad there are many, and we will have some examples, okay?
So what about you, Karina? Nobody even, I didn't hear any company yet.
Yeah, well, I'm going to refrain from citing anyone in my sector, but I do want to commend some of the leaders in the banking and insurance sector, and HSBC is one example, but but I'm thinking Allianz, Zurich Re, Swiss Re. I can't even. I'm embarrassed that I don't know all the names. But what's so important about these two sectors acting is that when they decide that they are going to put climate change at the heart of how they lend and how they grant insurance coverage, that has a ripple effect across the industrial world. So to cite one example, Swiss Re announced about 3 months ago that starting 2023, it was going to discontinue reinsurance coverage of oil and gas companies that had a carbon intensity indicator above a certain threshold, all right? So I immediately went to our head of insurance to say, are we on the right or the wrong side of this threshold? Because 3 years is not a lot of time to completely transform your, your industrial base in order to meet a cap that's been imposed by a pretty influential reinsurance company. The answer I got was, yes, we're on the right side because we've been working on this for years to reduce our carbon intensity. But what was also interesting is that the fact that Swiss Re will withhold coverage from all the companies that are above the line means that those companies are going to pay more for their insurance coverage. You would think that they will start acting now to shift the way that they do business, and that's the point, of course. It's not just about Swiss Re reducing the risk that it's taking on its books, because frankly, all of us are facing this risk because it is systemic risk. We all live on the same planet. But the point here is that the banks and the insurance companies, how they lend, how they insure, and by extension, the asset managers who they invest in, has the potential to really transform the way that companies in the real economy make key long-term decisions. So this is, it's no secret that the TCFD has focused its attention on financials and energy, and that's the reason why. I know that initially, when the TCFD came out, a lot of people were scratching their heads, like, why financials? Financials, they just push paper around. But actually, no, how they lend and how they insure has a dramatic impact on the economy.
Okay, I have another question here from my board member from IBGC, Leonardo Wangover. He's asking that, considering clean energy technology is becoming more and more cheap, don't you think we could see a better scenario for ESG and climate change in the future? So the impact of clean energy becoming cheaper.
I think so. I think yes. The only thing is that we don't have yet a technology that is able to really, make it for the non-clean energy yet. So I think it's a transition also in technology. And what we need are companies focusing on developing these new technologies. But we still don't have at this time. So that's why it's so important to have many actions to compensate in some way the emissions while we are not able to just, read them off.
Well, there's an additional challenge with clean energy. So the costs have come down dramatically, which is fantastic. And it certainly removes one major obstacle, which is that, no, we're not going to invest in it because it's cheaper to use coal or oil or gas. But there is one obstacle that we have yet to overcome, and that is intermittency. In other words, you have the energy when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining. But when neither of those things are happening, you have to then turn to traditional dirtier forms of energy to close the gap. And so what you see are hybrid plants that are gas and solar, Or what you also need to do is the more you integrate electricity grids across wider areas, the more that you can compensate for dips in sunshine and wind in one area by transmitting excess energy from other areas. The other thing you do is you turn the consumer into something called the prosumer. In other words, a consumer who's also a producer. So if consumers increasingly have solar panels on their roof, they use what they need and they put their excess into the grid. So they're both consumer and producer. And if the grid is producing too much clean energy at a given time and there's nowhere for it to go, they will push it out to people to charge up their cars overnight so that the car battery becomes a store of energy. So these are still happening on a very small scale. And the challenge is to move this to a bigger scale so that ultimately clean energy can displace the dirtier energies. But until we have storage technologies that overcome the underlying concern about not having security of supply, there is going to be a need for these other traditional forms of energy. And then the other thing is the so-called hard to abate sectors. So cement, steel, there are sectors out there that are such massive, massive consumers of energy that the alternatives to coal have yet to surface. But now all the talk is hydrogen. So right now, hydrogen is what's called brown hydrogen. It's made from methane. It's a dirty process. In other words, it's a carbon-intensive process. But as we become more successful at bringing the cost down of producing hydrogen from clean sources using clean energy, and the predictions as of this morning are that we will reach cost parity in 2030, which means that it'll be sooner than that because the numbers are always getting better, then we can envision a world where these sectors that are dependent on old, dirty energies can shift to hydrogen. So you're going to see a lot of attention paid to hydrogen.
I totally agree with Karina, and I think the challenges that need to be addressed are intermittency and scalability. So it's very nice when I go to the power plant in Sobradinho and I see the solar cells on top of the reservoir. So it's nice, but that's not yet scalable.
Exactly.
Talking about scalability, we have to bring back nuclear into the picture. So it's been a lot of prejudice against that. And it brings back the focus on the R&D gap that we have in Brazil. I would argue that Brazil has had the most successful climate change abatement program in the ethanol program over the past 40 years. Yeah. And we lost that edge. I mean, we've been underinvesting, we're losing opportunities, and we are not engaged internationally into making these solutions globally acceptable. So if Brazil is a player to create such solutions, we could be leaders again. Otherwise, I fear we will end up paying lots of royalties and importing lots of infrastructure because we lost an edge that we once had.
So, Mauro, I would like to jump in this point, talking about the role of government, of public policy. So how can we change this scenario? Because, you know, we have the tools to do a wonderful job in the energy sector here in Brazil. We are not doing so well. How to change that? What can we do as business leaders?
Being on the board of 2 state-owned companies, may I defer to my colleagues to answer that question?
I would love to see your answer, but Denise, help Mauro, please.
I think we are in a moment where pandemic is distracting everyone. And if you think about how people will react now to this, we will not get too much, excitement about it. But I think along the years and with the reactions that investors had, we saw a movement recently, the government concerned about what international investors may do. They could really make a lot of movement. I don't see in the short term, not because they don't want to, but because we, in this country, really, we have many things distracting ourselves.
Yes, we do. Karina,
Yeah.
be absolutely comfortable to talk about us. So you have a waiver for that, okay?
Okay. Well, so, I mean, this is why this initiative was created, because it's in our hands to change policy. No one actor single-handedly can change policy, but inertia and saying that it's, his job is going to guarantee that nothing happens. So part of the focus of this initiative of Chapter Zero Brazil, which is in the process of creating itself, includes focusing on the role of business leaders in engaging with policymakers to change the policy environment. Now, that's a challenge in a situation where the public may not prioritize this, where certainly the government at this point in Brazil and in the United States and in the Philippines and in many places does not prioritize this. But there are lots of influences on what drives government policy. And one of them is the financial markets. So a week or two ago, a group of institutional investors who between them represent $3.7 trillion, sent a letter to several Brazilian embassies around the world, warning that the current government's policy on deforestation was going to make Brazilian sovereign paper much less attractive and certain Brazilian companies much less attractive destinations for capital. Now, you could argue that this is nobody, it's not their business, and foreign investors have no business telling a sovereign nation what to do. And it goes back to my earlier point about the old rules are going out the window because we are faced with an emergency. So people are saying things that they would not have said 5 years ago, right? Or even last year. And now you see investors contacting embassies, writing to government representatives and saying, you are going to suffer a reduction in investment flows unless you change your policies. So you could argue that this is some form of, modern day imperialism, but at the end of the day, the capital flows matter, because if Brazilian companies are accessing capital through the global capital markets and their cost of capital goes up because people are turning against Brazil. I see this, by the way, serving on an Italian board. When you look at the fundamentals of my company, they are not reflected in the share price. And there is a widespread conviction that there's an Italy discount because of, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm gonna say it, because of perceptions of poor governance at a national level in Italy. And that weighs on the share price and the market perception of Italian listed companies. I'm sure that to some extent that exists in many countries. And if Brazil as a country is perceived as mishandling one of the most valuable resources in the world, that is going to mean something to the cost of capital for Brazilian companies. It's also true, turning to Denise's point about opportunities, that Brazil is sitting on a fantastically valuable resource that can be monetized. I mean, there are so many opportunities to collect rents from international investors to protect the forest, to avoid deforestation, to restore degraded forests. There is money in that. And that is, I mean, I'm working with people in Malaysia through the Malaysian chapter of Chapter Zero to develop exactly that, because Malaysia, along with Indonesia, has been converting its virgin forests into palm oil plantations. And now you have moratoria on palm oil. The EU is discontinuing complete, importation of palm oil. So you're going to be looking at palm oil plantations that are worthless. This is an asset that can be monetized and restored to valuable forests. So Brazil is not as far gone, I think, as Malaysia is, in having destroyed most of its or a huge proportion of its virgin forests. But there are opportunities that we need to pursue, and that Brazil certainly can pursue.
Guys, I have several questions here related to the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 in the near future. So COVID-19 and the pandemic will accelerate or is going to step the movement to a cleaner future? At your opinion?
I'll say by myself, not for the task force, but by myself. I think is a great opportunity for companies to rethink the way they are going to do things. You know, it was such an important stop in all processes, in everything that we were doing, that would it be really a pity if companies don't rethink many things, not only regarding the climate change risk, but I don't know. I think the urgency still will be, to get back on track. So I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'm skeptical of a new holistic view on the topic because of COVID. But as I said, I think COVID gives the opportunity to bring risk management to the top of the agenda, and with it, climate change. So this is the path I would like to believe in.
I'm open. Okay. There's a really interesting statistic that came out in the UK, whereby, so in 2016, the government conducted a pandemic response audit and found that we were unprepared, and found that, it was necessary to spend X, and decided not to. The report went on a shelf and we never did it. We spend in one day what it would have cost back then to invest in pandemic preparation. One day. So, so to my mind, what this pandemic has taught us is that we operate in an extremely fragile ecosystem. In this case, it's a health system that turned out to be far more fragile than we realized. In the case of climate, it's a generalized ecosystem that includes health effects, but is much broader. And so I think, for one thing, in boardrooms, what it has done is it has shaken the complacency that existed up until now about ignoring those tail risk events. I mean, I used to be the only voice in the boardroom that would say, okay, fine. I know that you are all convinced that the policy environment will never shift to forcing companies like ours to adapt to a net zero world, to a 1.5 degree average increase in temperature. But let's just model it. Let's just put it on the curve, and let's just assign it a probability of, 5%. Let's just put it on the risk map rather than not put it on the risk map, just so that we can test whether we're prepared for it if it were to happen. Just getting that argument across, I was unsuccessful. And what this pandemic shock is doing is it's making everybody realize that even these extreme events need to be modeled for. So I think in that sense, it will have a beneficial effect on decision makers in boardrooms and government and so forth. But then people forget very quickly. And so it's incumbent on us to keep that lesson front of mind, and that we act on those lessons, and that we invest. So I think that, yes, right now everybody is distracted, and Brazil particularly. But take the United States, which is a complete mess, absolutely chaotic. There's a reasonable chance that will change. And when that if it changes, fingers crossed, inshallah, there is a good chance that the attitude to climate change will improve. I don't think it'll be a complete shift because it's still the United States, but I do think that there's the prospect of positive change. And then there's a prospect of resuming our focus on multilateralism, because I think the biggest victim of the last few years has been the collapse in multilateralism. And you need that to confront major threats like pandemics, like climate change. The pandemic threatens that multilateralism. It is inducing people to turn on themselves. And that's, I think, the greatest the greatest scourge, the greatest challenge that we need to overcome in order then to confront these bigger challenges together.
Okay, now I would like to change a little bit and bring to a different subject here. We're talking about changing from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And we have two movements that I think are important, and I would like to know your opinion about them. I'm talking about big corporations, and I'm talking about conscious capitalism. Do you think this is relevant, or this is not going to become mainstream shortly?
Aron, we didn't plan on this. I'm sorry to say that I don't believe in big corporations. I did my homework, and I think it's a very well intended initiative, but the unintended consequences may be very bad. My understanding is that every single responsibility that the B corporation brings into the bylaws is already part of the fiduciary duty of directors. So it doesn't need to be added specifically. And when it is, it sort of provides an all-encompassing protection against prosecution and liability for directors. So I think it is a very complicated situation. And I ask you one question. Imagine if Petrobras was a B corporation in the last decade, all of the things they did could have been seen as legal because it would be under the name of a broader societal goal. So I don't think a company needs to be a B corporation to do the right things.
Denise and Karina?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting to see Mauro's position on that.
You know, he told us he's the new kid in the block and the bad one.
No, but I tend to agree with Mauro. I think we created in the last years a concept of big corporations as being the solution for everything, and there's no panacea. There's no panacea, and governance and responsibility, and it's all about not only being a corporation. So I totally agree with Mauro.
Karina?
So I slightly disagree, not fundamentally. I agree with the point that current rules do leave space for companies to act with purpose. So I don't think it's necessary to shift to a different model necessarily to do the right thing. What I would emphasize, I'm not sure I'm disagreeing with you, but neither of you said it, is that what this pandemic has taught us is that if we as companies fail to take an interest in the health of the ecosystem in which we operate, we are doomed to fail as a business. In other words, if there's a pandemic, we can't do business. I mean, the oil industry is an extreme example of how our business models are existentially threatened because of a failure in public health governance. Now, it was never our job as companies to manage public health, but the failure of public health is destroying our business. Just like I would argue that the failure to manage the refugee crisis in Europe has led to Brexit, which is devastating for business, all right? So it wasn't our job as business leaders to solve the refugee crisis, but guess who's paying a really heavy price for the failure of society and political leaders to address it? So, and you could make that argument for many things, for de-skilling and social inequality and various societal ills that are the job of government to fix, but government fails and business pays the price. So extreme manifestations of this have been that in Italy, which was, as you know, initially, the worst affected, companies like mine jumped in and started building hospitals. We're not in that business, but somebody had to do it. And it was almost like a wartime situation, and we just did. Now, nobody is suggesting that we should continue to play this role going forward. It's not appropriate, but when the world is falling apart and people are dying, and you have the wherewithal to help, you just do it. And I can tell you that in the boardroom, there was not even a second's hesitation. In fact, when management came to us and said, permission requested for a 25 million euro contribution to doing these different things, the reaction in the room was only 25 million? And we increased it to 30. This is public. I'm not telling you something that isn't. Well, the fact that it went from 25 to 30 because of board pressure is not public, but the fact that we paid that is public. And it was illustrative of how companies can throw out the window what they perceive to be their role in a time of extreme crisis. So again, I don't want to suggest that this is the long-term way going forward, but I do think that what it has left behind is an understanding that if we allow the social fabric in which we operate to collapse, we don't have a business. We don't have a viable business, which gets me back to my original point that I want to see my CEO meeting with political leaders to demand that certain policy changes be made, not just because it's going to help society, but because we need that in order to function as a business. And I would like to see business leaders around the world recognize that they depend on a healthy political system that involves sound public health provision and good public education and good police and good fire and all those things that we need. We can't privatize everything because the world falls apart. I mean, no matter how rich you are, if your neighbor is, or if the person in the street is dying of COVID-19, you risk catching it. So you can't buy your way out of this crisis. And so that's why I do think that this pandemic has potential to leave us with some important lessons about the role and purpose of business.
Karina, I totally agree with you. And I just don't think we need to reinvent the wheel with the B corporation or new clauses to the bylaws, because, and I like to use an argument that I've used since the discussions for the third edition of the IBGC code, when we were discussing the imperative for sustainability. And I say, listen, the imperative is on the bylaws, because in Brazilian corporations, usually Article 2 of the bylaws says that the time span of the corporation is indeterminate. This means forever. Mm-hmm. This means beyond the horizon of a spreadsheet. So this is why you have a fiduciary duty as per your bylaws to think about sustainability. You don't need nothing else.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, I'm not supposed to argue with my...
Please.
Yeah, so I'm going to make a call to Mauro after our webinar. Now, I do believe that in some way, business as usual put us in this situation. Something has to change. I don't know exactly what, but something really has to change. And another thing that I would like to bring to the table, we are almost running out of time, but I do know I can anticipate Mauro's reactions and maybe Denise's too, but there are two other things. No, it's okay. We are still friends, okay? But anyhow, talking about, there's a leader, a very important leader. He's not a business leader, but I think he's a wonderful leader. It's Pope Francis, okay? So it is this economy of Francisco. Are you aware of this movement related to very important scholars in Europe and the United States? So it's happening, this economy of Francisco. And there's other movement of impact business, social business, Mohammed Yunus and stuff. Do you think this has a role to play, or is this just a diversion?
I don't think it's a diversion. I think that, like many movements, impact investing and impact-oriented businesses are kind of like the pointy edge of change. And as it becomes more understood, it will flow into the way mainstream businesses behave. I always am interested to see what the pioneers are doing. They have a label when they start out, and if they're really good at what they do, we steal their ideas.
Any comments, Denise?
Couldn't put it better.
Okay, so we have still a few minutes, and I would like to hear from you, your final comments. Maybe, Karina, talking about Chapter 0 in Brazil, how Chapter 0 will develop in Brazil. Denise, your initiative, how it will develop in Brazil. And Mauro, your comments about what can we do. Because my concern here, you're seeing those pictures behind me. They were made by wonderful artists, my grandchildren, okay? And there's this article, an old one, called the grandparent agenda, or something like that. And you bring up your concern about your grandchildren, your grandson or grandchild.
Granddaughter,
So,
yeah.
Granddaughter, okay. So I'm really concerned about the future of those guys, really concerned. And timing, we are running out of time very fast, you see. That's why it really bothers me a lot, you see. All the things you said, Denise and Mauro and yourself, they make sense. They make sense. The problem is that they are not powerful enough to accelerate the solutions we need. That's what it really bothers me a lot, timing. So please, for your final comments before we finish this wonderful conversation. Okay. Let's make it different. Mauro, let's start with you. Be optimistic, please.
I think there's a great deal to learn, and I'm learning. I'm on step 5 of the Chapter 0 self-assessment. So I see that I can be a much better director than I am today, helping companies really be ready for the long term, getting away from all this humdrum of the extremely long and detailed board meetings, nose in, fingers in that we have in Brazil, and really think strategically. Topics like that make us want to be better directors, quoting from the movie. So I'm very excited about the opportunity of learning and about the opportunity of impacting organizations to do what I think they should, were always supposed to be doing anyway. And I wanted to thank Karina and Denise for the opportunity to learn more about it.
Denise?
I think I agree with Mauro, and if I can add that we do need a process of raising awareness, and I think this is a wonderful opportunity, because in the end, what is important for the companies, for the society, is to be resilient in a nice way, in a good way, so your granddaughters, grandsons are, would take advantage of almost the same word that we had. But really has to be a movement, a local movement associated with global movements. And even if I may agree or not agree, financial system plus investors have a real important role in this process. Real one. If they don't do anything, they say, oh, no, don't talk to me about that, because I want to continue to finance my clients. No, please, I don't want to sell my shares because I'm making money and I have a mandate that I have to go through, and if I don't give a profitability, I will be exchanged. So if we don't understand our role as systemic processes, then I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay,
all right. Look, when you're sitting inside a boardroom, you're sitting with a group of people of a certain generation who are used to making decisions in a certain way. But last March 18th to be exact, not this last March 18th of a year ago, was our first time ever presenting to the market on our energy transformation technologies. We hadn't yet announced the strategy, but we had a day for investors, taking them through our labs and showing them what we were doing. That was the first Fridays for Future event, where people, the traffic was terrible because getting to our event because of the kids everywhere. And I just thought it was so interesting that, you know, here we are, we the board directors and the management leadership and the investors who are all of a certain generation, who are all thinking more or less in the same way. And then we have our grandchildren out there who are banging pots and saying, you have failed us, right? And so to me, the lesson was, these kids are now 12, 13, 14, 15. They're our future employees, they're our future customers, and they are the voters, the future voters who are going to impact the legislative environment in which we operate. So all of those obstacles that we feel to making change, they have no patience. These kids demand that we act now. So I have some hope that thanks to their obstructing traffic, we're going to take notice, and the noise that they make outside the window of the boardroom is going to reach us inside, and we're going to think differently, and we're going to break through some of these old ways of thinking and recognize that we have no choice. We have to change, and we have to change now. And so we can either change because it's forced on us, or we can change in a way that we control. And I think doing it that way is better. So that's the argument. It's not about a disruptive and costly revolution. It's about saying, hold on a minute, you can't push me because I'm going to jump. Just let me decide how I'm going to jump, you know?
Okay, guys, thank you so much for your time. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you to our audience. And I want to say just a quote from Victor Hugo, the novelist, thinking about ESG. There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I do hope that this conversation about ESG as an important agenda for business is for real and not just small talk, okay? Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Now I'm going back to Portuguese, okay? I have to make a message here in Portuguese. Okay. So, então, muito obrigado a todos vocês, tá certo? Eu aprendi muito nessa conversa, aprendi muito. Não fiquei chateado com a opinião de ninguém, tá certo? Achei que o Mauro fez um papel maravilhoso de fazer contraponto, a Denise também. Enfim, Karina, foi muito bacana, tá certo? Eu quero avisar para vocês que nós vamos ter um próximo IBGC Conecta no dia 10 de julho, às 14 horas, e o tema é muito relevante e mais fácil, está mais próximo, tá certo? Saneamento básico, né? E nós vamos conversar sobre saneamento básico, a governança das agências reguladoras do setor. Nós vamos ter aqui também um time de peso, né? A Cristiane Dias, que é diretora-presidente da ANA, o Benedito Braga, que é o diretor-presidente da Sabesp, o Hélio Luiz Castro, que é o diretor-presidente da Arcesp, e o Gessner Oliveira, que é professor e coordenador do Grupo de Economia da Infraestrutura e Soluções Ambientais da Getúlio Vargas. Muito obrigado a todos. O evento está encerrado. Tchau.
Obrigada.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Tchau.
Ciao.